the vastness of the desert, the wind whispers an ancient, age-old secret. Was it a divine miracle that defied the laws of nature, or simply a natural phenomenon interpreted through faith? Between history and myth, thousands crossed into the unknown. The truth lies beneath the waters. Are you ready to discover it?
Shalom. Shalom. Thank you for being here once again on your channel, La Mishnah TV. Today we join together worldwide in the study of the weekly Torah portion, or Parashah, which is studied simultaneously across the globe, with Parashat Beshalaj and the miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. For centuries, this story has been repeated, believed, questioned, and in many cases reduced to a simple children's story. A sea that parts, a people who cross, an army that disappears. But the uncomfortable question remains, what really happened at the so-called Red Sea? Or, as the Hebrew text says, at the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. Today we will not only offer you traditional answers, but we will open up a range of views and perspectives to better understand the biblical account. We will raise profound questions that perhaps surpass the answers. Because this is not just a biblical story. It is one of the most studied, debated, and reinterpreted episodes in all of human history. Scientists, historians, linguists, rabbis, and mystics have tried to decipher what lies behind this event that marked the birth of Israel as a nation. In this documentary-style class, we will analyze the parting of the sea from multiple perspectives, without dogma and without reductionism. Today, I believe this will strengthen our knowledge and convictions. First, if you stay for this class, you will learn the scientific perspective. What do oceanographers, geologists, and physicists say today? Are there natural models that explain such a phenomenon? Winds, tides, earthquakes, extreme climate changes? Today you will learn about the enigmas that science is still trying to solve, and why, even with modern models, this event remains extraordinary.
The second thing you will learn in this video is the actual biblical text, in original Hebrew without dogmatic translations. You won't believe it. I can tell you that much. Not the translation you know, but the Hebrew written by the hand of the prophet Moses. Does it really say Red Sea? What does Yam Suf mean? What nuances are lost in translation?
Today you will discover precisely what the Hebrew text says, and how a single word can completely change our understanding of the story. Third, we will teach you the tradition of Judaism on this subject, what has been taught in synagogues for centuries, and which you may never have heard before. The Midrash, the Talmud, and the Kabbalah do not read this event as a simple historical or mythological chronicle. Did the sea physically part, or were spiritual dimensions also opened? What role do faith, fear, silence, and human merit play? Today, you will learn what tradition has taught for centuries and why this episode remains central to Israel's spiritual identity. These three promises guide this study. To understand the enigmas that science has yet to solve, to hear what the original Hebrew text truly says, and to understand the depth of the traditional Hebrew interpretation. Only in this way can we have a holistic, broad, and honest view of the Yam Suf, observing it from different perspectives, without fear of complexity. My name is Abel Flores, and I am incredibly grateful that you are here studying with us. Remember that I will be personally reading your comments and questions and responding to each of them with great interest. You can leave your comments below in the comments section of this video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes, and visit our website, lamishna.com, to access more material, studies, and in-depth analyses. You can even find this study in written form on the website, so you can take notes. Now, let's cross this sea of questions together. When we discuss the parting of the Red Sea from a scientific perspective, It's helpful to begin with an honest and liberating clarification. Science does not investigate miracles. It cannot prove or disprove divine intervention. That belongs to another category of knowledge, perhaps metaphysical. What science can do is something more modest, yet fascinating. Ask whether there are physical mechanisms capable of producing a scenario similar to the one described in the biblical text. And here the starting point changes completely. From a physics standpoint, the account doesn't require an ocean split in two with vertical walls of water. A very cinematic image, but not very hydrodynamically plausible. What is being investigated is something else. A temporary lowering of the water level, which physicists call a setdown, or a lateral displacement caused by persistent wind, known as wind-driven setup and setdown.
In simple terms, a strong wind, sustained for hours, even days, can push large masses of water to one side, exposing areas that are normally submerged. This is not theory. It is documented in coastal lagoons, shallow estuaries, and enclosed seas. Science can model these processes with fluid dynamics equations,
Meteorological data, and paleo-environmental reconstructions. However, science also knows when to say this far and no further. It can assess whether the seabed would be muddy or relatively firm. It can calculate how long a passable strip would remain exposed. It can estimate the speed and force of the water's return when the wind ceases. But it cannot explain the timing, the perfect synchronicity with a specific human escape.
and here lies the most interesting limit. Physics can explain the partial how. It cannot explain the why, nor the precise when. Science describes mechanisms. The biblical text speaks of meaning. Confusing these two levels impoverishes both. Separating them, on the other hand, allows us to better understand the phenomenon
and respect the mystery. When science seriously considers how the waters of the Yam Suf could have receded, one mechanism appears again and again, with remarkable consensus: wind setdown. And it's worth pausing here, calmly and precisely, because we are not talking about an exotic hypothesis, but about well-known physics. Wind setdown occurs when a strong wind blows continuously over a relatively shallow body of water. A mere gust is not enough. It has to be persistent, consistent, almost stubborn. This wind pushes the water downwind to the opposite side from where it is blowing. The result is twofold and very clear. On the windward shore, where the wind is coming from, the water level drops. Under extreme conditions, the bottom can be exposed. At the same time, at the opposite end, water accumulates and the level rises. This mechanism is not speculative. It is described and measured in oceanography and limnology, in lakes, coastal lagoons, estuaries, and enclosed seas. It is pure fluid dynamics applied to real systems. Now, the most cited study on this topic took a more ambitious step. It used an advanced hydrodynamic model known as ROMS, applied to plausible scenarios of the eastern Nile Delta, in an area sometimes identified as the Lake of Tanis. There, it simulated what would happen under intense and sustained winds on the order of tens of meters per second. The result? Under certain conditions, the model shows the opening of a temporary corridor. Not a narrow passage, but a strip several kilometers long and several kilometers wide, which could remain open for hours. Enough, at least in physical terms, to allow a human crossing. And what does this contribute scientifically? It contributes something crucial. It demonstrates that it is not necessary to violate natural laws for the water to recede quickly and dramatically. If the bathymetry is suitable, if there are natural channels, sandbars, and a persistent, well-oriented wind, the phenomenon is physically possible.
In addition, the model provides concrete numbers, duration of the event, wind intensity, and geometry of the passage. But this is where science, honestly, stops. What it cannot resolve is the exact paleogeography. We don't know with millimeter precision what the lagoons, the branches of the Nile, the depths, and the topography were like more than 3,000 years ago.
and small differences in the terrain change the entire outcome.
That's why these types of studies don't confirm a historical fact. They describe a physical if-then scenario. If the place was like this, if the wind was like this, then the water could have receded in this way. Even before these modern models, there was already another classic line of explanation focused on the Gulf of Suez and nearby shallow areas.
The idea is the same: sustained wind, favorable geometry, displaced water, exposed seabed, and then a rapid return when the forcing ceases. Science, in short, doesn't explain the meaning of the crossing. It explains that the physical mechanism is not absurd, and sometimes just that is already a revelation. Now, there's a critical condition that physics doesn't compromise on: the location. Not just any place will do. For a significant wind setdown to occur, the body of water must be shallow and, in addition, have the right shape. The geography here is not a secondary detail. It's the heart of the phenomenon. From a physical point of view, the most plausible scenario is not a deep, open sea, but rather shallow lagoons, marshes, and lakes, especially in regions like the Isthmus of Suez or the eastern Nile Delta. There, the water responds much more sensitively to the force of the wind. A shallow bottom, a gentle slope, and natural channels can significantly amplify the local water recession. Imagine a shallow bathtub. A constant push of the water to one side quickly exposes the bottom. Now imagine an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The same push barely changes the water level. The difference is not in the force, but in the depth and the geometry. That's why scientific models insist so much on areas with gentle slopes and channels that act as natural funnels. In these contexts, the wind doesn't just push the water, it guides it, concentrates it, and removes it from very specific sectors, creating temporary exposed corridors. In contrast, when we look at deep water scenarios, such as the Gulf of Aqaba, the physical plausibility drops drastically. There, the depths are great, the slopes are steep, and the volume of water is immense. The wind can generate waves, currents, and level variations, but it cannot empty a kilometer-long corridor to make it passable, not with the same ease, nor in the same time frame. This explains why so many scientific studies move away from the popular image of a deep sea parting in two, and instead focus on scenarios of reedy lakes, coastal lagoons, and deltaic areas. It's not an ideological preference, it's a physical conclusion. Science, at this point, is not saying where the crossing occurred. It's saying something more basic and more honest. If a wind-induced water retreat occurred, it had to be in a shallow place with a very specific geometry. The shape of the terrain is not a detail of the story. It is the condition that makes it possible. Now, in addition to wind setdown, science has explored other hypotheses to explain a temporary retreat of the water. They do exist, but when we examine them closely, they prove weaker or extremely site-dependent. And physics, as always, is not impressed by good intentions. One of these ideas is that of internal tides, oscillations, and the phenomenon known as seiche. In semi-enclosed bodies of water, such as lagoons or elongated lakes, changes in atmospheric pressure and wind can cause oscillations in the water level, almost like the sloshing of water in a glass that someone is gently moving. These oscillations are well documented. They can raise or lower the water level locally, and in certain cases contribute to leaving areas more exposed. But here's the limitation. On their own, they rarely generate a wide, stable, and passable path for hours. They function more as a secondary factor, an amplifier, not as the main driver of the phenomenon. Without a sustained wind persistently pushing the water, the seiche does not reach the magnitude required by the narrative. Another, much more striking hypothesis is that of tsunamis or seismic events. It is true that a tsunami usually begins with a dramatic retreat of the water before the arrival of the main wave. The image is powerful and therefore frequently appears in popular literature. But from a scientific point of view, the problems are serious. First, a specific and well-located seismic source is needed, as well as geological evidence compatible with that event in the correct time period. Second, the dynamics are not very friendly for a human crossing. The retreat is usually rapid, chaotic, and extremely dangerous. The return of the water does not wait for hours, it arrives violently. It does not offer a stable corridor or a reasonable margin of time. Therefore, when comparing hypotheses, the tsunami loses strength. Not because it is impossible, but because it fits less well with a scenario of a relatively wide and temporarily sustained passage. In short, these alternative hypotheses can provide nuances, local conditions, or complementary effects. But when science seeks the most robust mechanism for a shallow lagoon environment, sustained wind remains the undisputed protagonist. Sometimes, the most solid explanation is not the most spectacular one, but the one that best adheres to the laws of water and time. Although we are discussing the scientific perspective today, there is a point where even the best physics begins to lose its footing. That point is called paleogeography, and it is, without exaggeration, the biggest bottleneck in the entire debate. Why? Because a physical model, however sophisticated, needs a landscape. Without a reliable reconstruction of what the terrain, water, channels, and depths actually look like, the model doesn't identify a historical location. It only describes a possibility. In regions like the Isthmus of Suez and the Eastern Nile Delta, the situation is particularly complex. Over millennia, entire systems of lakes and marshes existed and disappeared. Bala, Timsah, the Bitter Lakes, among others. The Nile channels changed course. Sandbars shifted. Areas that are dry today were covered with water, and others now flooded were dry land.
Therefore, the real technical discussion among scientists is usually not whether the water could have receded, but something much more specific and difficult. Where exactly could a wind setdown occur that would open a corridor? Does that corridor coincide with known ancient routes, with human settlements, with a topography consistent with the period? How stable
Were the depths, sediments, and channels during the proposed time? This is where certainty becomes elusive. Paleo-environmental reconstructions have significant margins of error. An extra meter of depth, a slightly shifted channel, a non-existent sandbar, and the result changes completely. So what can a serious analyst say today, without dogmatism or apologetics? The most defensible conclusion, with high physical plausibility, is this: the wind set-down mechanism is real. Under sustained wind, it can expose land in shallow bodies of water. Furthermore, modern hydrodynamic models show that, with the appropriate bathymetry and geometry, a temporary passage can open in lagoon or delta areas. That is well-founded. What remains open, with high uncertainty, is the identification of the exact location of the crossing. It depends on reconstructions of the ancient landscape that are still incomplete. And then there's the human factor. Strong winds, potential darkness, mud, unstable sediments, and the logistics of managing a crowd. There are physically possible scenarios that, from a human perspective, border on the extreme.
And then there's what science, by definition, cannot resolve. It cannot determine whether the event was miraculous, purely natural, or a combination of natural conditions interpreted theologically. Science does not have the tools to pronounce on meaning. Therefore, if you are going to present the scientific view rigorously, the most honest summary is this.
Science doesn't need magic to explain a receding body of water. Sustained wind over shallow waters can open a temporary corridor. There are peer-reviewed models that quantify the hours, kilometers, and wind intensities in delta and lagoon scenarios. The big debate isn't whether it's physically possible, but where it happened, in what kind of landscape, and how compatible it is with the historical context. And that debate precisely remains open. Scientifically, the analysis leaves us with an open, almost inevitable question. What type of body of water does the text actually describe? An open sea, a deep gulf, a coastal lagoon, a system of marshes with channels and reeds? That answer, and this is crucial, cannot be provided by physics. Physics can tell us how water behaves. It can calculate winds, depths, and times. But it cannot tell us what landscape the author of the text had in mind. That's where we enter another territory, equally rigorous, but with different tools. That clue is not in the equations, but in the Hebrew, in the name itself, Yam Suf, in the semantic field of the word suf, in how the interpretive tradition understood that term for centuries. And also, let's be honest, in how certain later translations push the imagination toward a deep sea, perhaps more spectacular, but not necessarily more accurate. If you like, in the next step, we'll take the philological scalpel. We'll open the Hebrew text, letter by letter, and let the language suggest the landscape to us, because sometimes, before the waters part, you have to learn to read. Now we're going to move on to the second question we promised to answer in this video. So stay tuned as we delve into deeper studies of the Torah in Hebrew. When we shift from science to the biblical text, we completely change our tools. Here, we're no longer talking about physical models or persistent winds, but about philology, Hebrew semantics, and textual tradition. And this change is crucial, because the most common error in this whole matter is not scientific, it's linguistic. The Hebrew Bible doesn't speak of the Red Sea. That expression is not in the original text. It's a late inheritance from ancient translations, especially from the Greco-Roman world, which ended up shaping our modern imagination. Biblical Hebrew is consistent and precise. What it says again and again is Yam Suf.
Yam Suf appears repeatedly in the Exodus narrative, chapters 13 through 15, and also in other biblical books. To understand what landscape it describes, we have to break down the expression piece by piece. Let's start with Yam. Yam. In Hebrew, Yam doesn't exclusively mean open sea or deep ocean.
Its semantic field is much broader. It can refer to a sea, yes, but also to a large lake, a large body of water, and even coastal or lagoonal bodies of water. The classic example is the Kinneret, the so-called Sea of Galilee, which is actually a lake. And yet, the Bible calls it Yam without any problem. The conclusion is clear. The word Yam, by itself, doesn't force us to imagine a deep ocean or abyssal waters. That's a modern projection. Now we come to the decisive term, Suf, Sof. Here lies the core of the debate. The consonantal root, S-U-V-F, has two distinct semantic fields that intersected in the history of interpretation. On the one hand, Suf means aquatic vegetation, reeds, rushes, plants typical of marshy areas or shallow waters. This usage is neither ambiguous nor disputed. In Exodus 2:3, when it is recounted that Moses' mother places the baby's basket, the text explicitly states that she puts it among the reeds of the Nile. There is no doubt about it. Saf means reeds. No one translates that as end or red. On the other hand, there is the word suf, which means end. It is written with the same consonants, but it has a different vowelization and a different semantic field. In biblical Hebrew, as in so many ancient languages, it is the context that determines the meaning. And here, the context is decisive. In Yam Suf, the geographical and narrative context clearly points to an environment with aquatic vegetation, not to an end, and much less to a color. The idea of the Red Sea does not originate from the Hebrew. It comes from later translations that read the text with different geographical understandings in mind. So the biblical text, read in its original language, does not lead us to a deep open sea. It suggests something different, closer to shallow waters, with reeds, marshes, and vibrant shorelines. And that, curiously, fits much better with what physics considers possible. Before discussing miracles, the Bible invites us to something more fundamental. Now, during this short break in the middle of the class, we want to inform you that if you would like to make a donation, you can do so by scanning the QR code you see on the screen, or by clicking the link below in the description. Personally, I greatly appreciate your contribution.
In the vastness of the desert, the wind whispers an ancient, age-old secret. Was it a divine miracle that defied the laws of nature, or simply a natural phenomenon interpreted through faith? Between history and myth, thousands crossed into the unknown. The truth lies beneath the waters. Are you ready to discover it?
So, the question is inevitable. If the Hebrew text says Yam Suf, where did the famous Red Sea come from? The answer lies not with Moses or in the desert, but in a translation room of the Hellenistic world. In the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek
in a monumental work known as the Septuagint. That's where the decisive shift occurred. The translators did not opt for a literal translation of the term Yam Suf. Instead, they chose a geographical identification, Erythra Thalassa, literally Erythraean Sea, which in English ended up as Red Sea.
And here's the critical point. Erythra Thalassa was not a precise term as we understand it today. For the ancient Greeks, the Erythraean Sea was a broad, almost fluid concept. It could include what we now call the Red Sea, but also the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba, and even, in some classical authors, extensive areas of the Indian Ocean.
In other words, they weren't translating a Hebrew word. They were placing the narrative on the Greek mental map of their time. A different map with different categories, different names, and different boundaries. From there, the chain was sealed. From the Hebrew Yam Suf to the Greek Erythra Thalassa, from Greek to Latin Mare Rubrum, and from Latin to modern languages where Red Sea became almost untouchable, as if it had always been there. But it wasn't. It's an inherited translation, not an original definition, a linguistic tradition that carried with it an increasingly specific geographical image, and at the same time, one increasingly distant from the biblical Hebrew. And here's the final irony. For centuries, we've debated how the Red Sea parted, when the text never actually mentioned it. Sometimes, it's not the miracle that needs explaining. Now, what does the Hebrew actually suggest about the type of body of water? Without yet imposing theological interpretations, the language of the text itself sets limits and possibilities. And that, in a serious analysis, is already a lot. The first thing is what the Hebrew does not do. It doesn't force us to imagine a deep, open sea. It doesn't push us towards an abyssal ocean or a gulf of great depths. On the contrary, the semantic field of Yam Suf is perfectly compatible with coastal lagoons, marsh systems, and shallow lakes with aquatic vegetation. It's a humid, vibrant landscape with reeds, not a mass of dark blue water without shores. And here a remarkable coincidence appears. This type of body of water fits surprisingly well with the scenarios that science can model. Shallow waters subjected to sustained wind. This doesn't prove anything on its own, but it significantly narrows the range of possibilities. When we read the account from this Hebrew perspective, certain narrative details cease to be merely decorative and become very precise. The text says that the sea opens up due to a strong wind that blows all night, in Exodus 14:21. It's not a vague metaphor, it's a causal description. Something blows for hours, and the water responds. Furthermore, the text insists that the Israelites walk on dry land, yabashah, not on a muddy bottom. In Hebrew, the contrast is clear. It's not slippery mud or soft sediment, but traversable ground. And then, the return of the water is quick and violent, consistent with the collapse of a wind-driven surge when the wind ceases or changes. The narrative read carefully does not contradict this physical behavior.
But we must pause here, because the Hebrew is not trying to explain a mechanism. And this is fundamental. The biblical text is not a treatise on hydrodynamics. It is not interested in the how in physical terms. It describes what happens, not how it happens from the perspective of modern physics. The ultimate cause of the event is not the wind.
It is divine will. The wind appears as an instrument, not as an autonomous force. Forcing the text toward a closed naturalism impoverishes it. Forcing it toward a naive literalism does the same. Hebrew deliberately maintains this tension. So, if we rigorously answer the question, what does the Hebrew text actually say? The conclusion is quite clear. The Bible doesn't speak of the Red Sea, but of the Yam Suf. Suf means reeds, not red. The text is compatible with a shallow body of water, not necessarily a deep gulf. And it was later translations that, for centuries, shaped our geographical understanding of the story. Sometimes, to better understand the miracle, we don't need to look at the water. We need to return to the language. Now that we have listened carefully to what the Hebrew text says, the crucial question naturally arises. Not what we think today, but how this text was read by Judaism itself throughout the centuries. How did tradition understand the Yam Suf as an extraordinary physical phenomenon, as a spiritual symbol, as a historical event imbued with cosmic meaning, or perhaps as all of these things at once? Because something interesting happens here. For traditional Judaism, the Yam Suf was never just a point on the map. It wasn't merely water, wind, and geography. It was a threshold, a moment when visible and invisible reality touched. In the next part, we enter a different realm. We leave strict philology behind and open the Midrash, the Talmud, and the Kabbalah. There, the Yam Suf is no longer just a body of water that parts, but a spiritual, cosmic event, a disruption of order for the birth of a people. And there, curiously, the question is no longer how the sea parted, but what opened up within the human being. Don't go anywhere, because we're entering the final stretch of the lesson, and we will reveal a code that you will never forget whenever you read these biblical passages. We now come to the third question, and I'll tell you something with complete honesty. This is where everything we've discussed so far comes together. If until now we've talked about science and Hebrew, this is the interpretive heart of Judaism. What does tradition say about the parting of the Red Sea? But first, an essential methodological clarification. When we say the tradition, we're not talking about a single voice or a uniform interpretation. We're talking about three major interpretive layers, each with a different purpose, which don't contradict each other, but rather overlap. The Midrash, both halakhic and agadic, doesn't attempt to describe the event like a journalist or a physicist. Its function is to expand the text, to fill in the gaps, and to extract moral, pedagogical, and theological meaning. The Midrash asks, what do we learn from this moment? What is revealed about faith, fear, trust, and freedom? The Talmud, especially in its agadic passages, discusses the episode. It compares different versions, debates merits and responsibilities, and derives principles of leadership, ethics, and liturgy. Here, the Red Sea becomes a source for reflecting on how God acts in history and how human beings respond when there seems to be no way out. And then there is the Kabbalah. Here, the narrative shifts in scale. The Zohar and later mystical traditions read the parting of the Red Sea as a cosmic and spiritual breakthrough. Not only do the waters part, worlds open up, dimensions are unified, and hidden levels of reality are revealed. The crossing activates divine names and marks a before and after in the spiritual structure of the universe. And pay attention to this, because it's key. None of these layers is interested in reconstructing meteorology or geography. That's not their question. Tradition doesn't want to know what wind blew.
So stay with me until the end, because in the final part of this class, we will see something surprising. How, for Judaism, the Red Sea was not just an escape from Egypt, but the moment when the world itself learned to open up. And what that demands, even today, from each of us.
When the Midrash approaches the crossing of the Red Sea, it does so not to reconstruct an itinerary, but to educate the soul. For the Midrashic tradition, this episode is not merely a successful escape, but a test of faith, a pedagogical lesson, and in a sense, a recreation of the world. One of the most influential interpretations stems from a perplexing phrase addressed to Moses. "Why do you cry out to me?" in Exodus 14:15. The Midrash hears here more than just a question. It hears a correction, not because prayer is wrong, but because there are times when faith is no longer expressed in words, but in actions. The idea is as simple as it is demanding. Salvation does not come as a spectacle for passive spectators. It comes when the people move forward toward the sea. This principle is radical. God does not say, "Wait and see," but tell the people to march on. Faith at that moment is not contemplation. It is action taken at great risk.
Another Haggadic tradition goes even further, asserting that the sea did not part from a distance as a preventive measure. It parted when the people were already in the water, when the water reached their necks. The danger was real, not symbolic. The Midrash constructs here a powerful spiritual pedagogy. The miracle appears
At the edge of human limits, not before. Faith is not a comfortable certainty. It is a decision made in the midst of uncertainty. And then one of the most beautiful and profound images in all of Midrashic literature appears. The sea does not part into a single corridor, but into 12 paths, one for each tribe. Sometimes, the texts say, there were windows between them, so that they could see each other as they crossed. This is not a technical description. It is a theological statement. Israel crosses as one people, but without erasing their internal identities. Redemption, the Midrash teaches, does not demand homogenization. It demands coordination, unity without uniformity, a surprisingly modern message. The sages also enumerate what they call 10 miracles that occurred at the sea. It was not simply a matter of opening a path. The ground becomes firm. Walls of water provide protection. The environment adapts to sustain a vulnerable multitude. This is not a historical chronicle. It is a theological marvel. The entire sea is transformed into a grand stage of providence, where every detail collaborates with the divine purpose. And here we arrive at an even deeper idea, formulated in texts like Exodus Rabbah. The crossing of the Yam Suf, Red Sea, would not be an interruption of nature, but the fulfillment of a condition inscribed in creation itself, as if from the very beginning the world had been created with an internal clause. When the time comes for the divine purpose, nature will know how to yield.
This is key. Jewish tradition does not always oppose nature and miracle. Sometimes it teaches something more subtle and more radical. Nature is flexible because it ultimately depends on the will that created it. The miracle does not break the world. It reveals its profound obedience. Thus, for the
Midrash, the Yam Suf is not just water that parts. It is a classroom, a test, a mirror. There, one learns that faith walks, that the miracle awaits the courageous, that unity does not erase difference, and that the world itself was created with the capacity to open up when history demands it. And we are still not finished, because the Talmud and the Kabbalah will take this crossing even further. But that is the next threshold. Now, when the Talmud takes over from the Midrash, the focus shifts. It's no longer just about faith and miracles, but about leadership, merit, song, and ethics. The Sea of Reeds becomes a human laboratory where the behavior of a community is examined when danger is real and the enemy falls. The first question is uncomfortable and deeply political. Who entered the sea first? In Sotah 37a, a powerful tradition appears. Nachshon ben Aminadav, from the tribe of Judah, descends into the sea before the others. Only after this gesture, the sages say, do the waters part. The Talmud even preserves more tense versions, where the tribes argue, accuse each other, and hesitate, each waiting for the other to take the plunge. There is no romanticism here. There is social realism. On the brink of collective collapse, when everyone is looking at the water and no one is moving, someone must break the paralysis. The tradition transforms this gesture into a political spiritual principle. Leadership is not about giving orders from behind, but about taking the risk before others. That is why Judah receives the merit of future leadership, not because of lineage, but because of action under pressure. But the crossing is not the end. The Talmud insists that redemption does not culminate when one survives, but when one can sing. In Sotah 30b, the scene of the Shira, the Song of the Sea, unfolds. Israel sets its heart on singing. The sages use deliberately exaggerated images. Even children and infants participate. This is not naive literalism. Crossing the sea is physical liberation. Singing is liberation of meaning. It is the step from panic to consciousness, from chaos to the word. As long as there is no song, the event is only survival. When there is psalm, it becomes revelation. And then the Talmud introduces a moral tension that is still unsettling today. In Megillah 10b, a surprising scene is recounted. The angels want to sing while the Egyptians are drowning, and God stops them. My creatures are drowning in the sea, and you want to sing songs? The phrase is devastating. Tradition does not erase the victory, but it refuses to glorify the enemy's death. It acknowledges gratitude for salvation, but it does not transform the suffering of others into a virtue. Here, the Talmud consciously avoids two extremes. It does not fall into the moral triumphalism of, good, let them die, nor into a dehistoricized moralism that would say, then we shouldn't have sung. It maintains the discomfort, deliberately so, because it teaches that redemption and tragedy can coexist in the same moment. The Sea of Reeds, as interpreted by the Talmud, is not a simple happy ending. It is a complex, human, and ethical scene. There is leadership that takes risks. There is a people that learns to sing. And there is a God who remembers that even in victory, every life matters. And there is yet another, deeper layer. Because for the Kabbalah, at that moment, Israel was not the only one singing. Something much greater unfolded. But that is the ultimate level of the crossing.
When Kabbalah enters the picture, the question shifts. The focus is no longer on how the water parted, but on what was opened up in reality. For Jewish mysticism, and especially in the Zohar, the Yam Suf, Red Sea, is not a hydraulic event, but a cosmic one. In the classic mystical interpretation, the sea
represents a boundary. It is the hidden, the unrevealed, that which encloses, and at times, that which swallows. The sea is the domain of the concealed. When the sea parts, it's not just a physical passage that is created. An ontological barrier is broken. The hidden becomes traversable. The Yam Suf thus becomes the archetypal model of every spiritual crossing, moving from a closed state to an open one, from oppression to freedom, from the unconscious to the revealed. Therefore, in Kabbalah, the crossing of the sea is not merely an exodus from Egypt. It is the people's first great inner crossing. A humanity that learns that boundaries are not always walls. Sometimes they are thresholds. This idea is reinforced by a statement traditionally associated with the episode, almost scandalous in its audacity. What a maidservant saw at the sea, the great prophets did not see. The point is not social or hierarchical. It is spiritual. Kabbalah reads here an unprecedented revelation, not elitist, not reserved for a select few, a collective spiritual clarity. Translated into contemporary language, the message is powerful. It wasn't just a rescue. It was a peak of public revelation. Faith ceases to be an inherited tradition and becomes direct experience. The people don't believe because they were told.
And here appears one of the best known and also most misunderstood motifs of Kabbalah, the so-called 72-letter name. The Kabbalists observe that 3 consecutive verses, Exodus 14:19-21, have an unusual textual structure that allows for the derivation of letter combinations associated with 72
names. It is important to be precise. This is not the literal meaning of the text. It's not the literal meaning. It's a mystical interpretation. So what does it express? A profound thesis. Liberation occurs when channels of divine order are activated, reconfiguring reality. The world doesn't change randomly. It changes when hidden and visible levels align. The sea parts because something deeper opened first. Finally, the Zohar focuses on the human response, the song, the shira. In these interpretations, the song is not a belated applause. It is a spiritual act that completes the process. Divine intervention initiates the movement, but the human response seals it. The song orders, elevates, and acknowledges. That's why the Zohar associates this moment with the manifestation of divine kingship and the presence of the Shekinah. Simply and precisely put, God intervenes. The people respond. And that response is not merely symbolic. It is part of the event. Without the Shira, the opening remains incomplete. Thus, for Kabbalah, the Yam Suf is much more than water that parts. It is a cosmic opening, a total revelation, an instant in which the world shows that it can open up, and humanity discovers that its voice also has power. And with this, the crossing is complete. Science, text, tradition. 3 levels, 1 single threshold. We have reached the end of this journey. And if there's one thing I want you to take away today, it's this. We fulfilled what we promised in this class, in this in-depth and modern study of Parashat Beshalaj. We promised not to oversimplify. We promised not to choose between science and faith, between text and tradition, between reason and mystery. And what we discovered together is something deeper. The Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds, is not just an episode from the past. It is a model, a map, a threshold that repeats itself in every generation. Science showed us that the world is more flexible than it seems, that natural laws are not walls, but complex systems capable of opening unexpected pathways. Hebrew brought us back to the original text, cleansing it of centuries of translations that, without malicious intent, but with much ignorance of the original Hebrew mindset of the text, conditioned our imagination. And Jewish tradition reminded us of something essential. The true crossing is not only geographical, it is human, ethical, and spiritual. The Midrash taught us that faith walks, that there is no redemption for passive spectators. The Talmud made us uncomfortable, as a living tradition should, showing us leadership under duress, singing with awareness, and ethics even in the face of a defeated enemy. And Kabbalah took us to the deepest level, the Yam Suf as a cosmic opening, as a total revelation, as a moment when the hidden becomes accessible. If anything became clear, it is this. Judaism is not afraid of complexity. It doesn't shy away from difficult questions or the diversity of opinions, because each one enriches our faith, our culture, and our ethics. You don't need to turn off reason to turn on faith. On the contrary, it makes them dialogue. That is the message of Moses' Torah in each of its studies. And now I speak directly to you. If you've made it this far, it wasn't by chance. It means that you are not satisfied with quick answers or empty spiritual slogans. It means that you want to understand, to delve deeper, to truly study. That's why I invite you to stay with us, to subscribe, to join us on this path of serious, passionate, and honest study. Leave us your comments, ask questions, discuss, raise objections. I, Abel Flores, journalist and researcher, will be reading and responding personally, because learning is not a monologue. It's a lively conversation within this digital community we are building.
And if you want to delve deeper, visit our website, lamishna.com, which is the jewel of our study center. There you will find more material, more classes, more doors opening, and also our crowning achievement, the free course on the Mishnah. Yes, free, because we believe that transformative knowledge
Should be accessible to everyone. The Red Sea parted once, the story goes. But tradition whispers something even bolder. It continues to part for those who dare to move forward, study, and ask questions. Thank you for crossing this threshold with us. And remember, the most important thing is not how the sea parted. It's what you are willing to cross now and how far you are willing to go. That's all for today's class, and I'll see you in the next video, which I've linked here so you can continue with us. Shalom.